Thank you for the invitation to speak today and to be a part of your worship service. Our lesson for our worship time is a lesson that some of you may have never heard a lesson on it before. It's certainly a lesson you don't hear that often. But I think it's one that's important and significant, especially in the time and the era in which we live. And we simply titled the lesson this morning, Children Matter. Children matter. I've had the privilege, as Brother Levi mentioned, through the years to be able to go here and there and to speak many places. And I've had observations that I can make and have made about all these churches where I've been. I've been able to sort of classify them and sum them up in many different ways. And one of the ways that I have summed up these places where I've been would be in the way that they deal with their young people and their children. I've been to places through the years where I would go and in that church there would be no children. There would be no teenagers. And you would go and you'd speak in the meeting and you really long to just see a child. You long to see a teenager in that church. And I'll have to confess to you that in my early days, crying babies bothered me. They did. It was just a young thing. But after going to church after church after church, where there were no children and there were no teenagers, I changed my mind about that. And I'll tell you today, crying babies don't bother me anymore. In fact, in some of those churches where I have preached, by Sunday night or Monday night or Tuesday night, I was just begging for a child to cry. I was just begging to see some teenager that would be a part of the service of the church. The future of that church didn't look well. Another group of churches that I've gone to are churches, and this could be a large church, a small church, but they had young people. They had teenagers and they had babies. And you could tell that they loved their children in that church. You could tell in that church that the children really mattered. Why, you looked at their budget and you could see that a lot of money was spent because they understood the significance and the importance of bringing those children up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. You could watch that church and you could see that not only just the parents were involved in the lives of their children, but even the whole church was. The eldership, the older people. There was a concern and a yearning, even though it wasn't their children. And maybe their children had already grown and gone. But there was a love for those children in that church. And there was a tremendous investment made in that church. And then, a third group along this lines that I've noticed is that whether it could be a small church or a large church, you would go to this church and they had young people and they had children. But it seemed like that the children really didn't matter. It was you looked at their budget and you saw that very little, or even if they knew how much they spent on their young people, they didn't know. They had no idea. You could see that parents they weren't involved. You could see that if they had a youth minister, that they just turned it over to the youth minister and said, you take care of this situation. The older folks weren't involved. The leadership really wasn't all that concerned. Now here's the sad thing, folks. Here's the sad thing. That church that I've just described, if something doesn't change, will one day become like that first church that I mentioned, that had no children and it had no young people. This is one of the reasons why, Brother Levi mentioned it, this is one of the reasons why I've been involved in Lads to Leaders so much through all the years. In fact, I volunteer now. I do one workshop a month for Lads to Leaders and I volunteer my time. I say, just take me, use me. Because it works. It gives these churches that have a need to feel in helping their young people and getting their church involved, the young people and the older people involved together in the work. And I've been sold on that because I've seen the significance and I've seen what's been happening in our churches across our brotherhood. Folks, we live in a culture today, and I think you'll agree with me, that is devaluing children. We live in a culture in America where it seems that people don't want to be bothered with children anymore. Every day in this country, little children are physically abused. They're verbally abused. They are sexually abused. You probably saw something this week on TV about the death of a little child, the smothering of a little child left in a vehicle, the killing, horrible killing of a little child. It's every week, folks. We see it. We see it on the internet. We see it on television. We see it maybe even in our own communities. How that it seems there is a devaluing of children today. Today in America, many children don't have the health care that they need. So many children today are living below the poverty level. So many children today are living in crime-infested areas, and they don't have much of a chance. So many of those children that are living in crime-infested cities are being killed by gangs. And today across America, children are going to schools that have become more concerned with immoral social issues than with teaching, reading, writing, arithmetic, and science. You say, Brother Hines, you look back in time and you see that children have always had difficult times. Well, go back to the Depression, or go back when we grew up, and there were children who lived in a poverty level. There was children who lived in crime-stricken areas. Yes, but it seems today, and maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me today that the difference is that there is a devaluation of little children. Now, there are a lot of indicators, folks, and I don't have time to go into all these indicators that show this. I'll tell you one of the indicators in this society, and that's abortion. When you take a society that will abort almost 1 million children, and even a society that will promote even aborting them right up to birth, there's something wrong. There's something wrong with a society who wants to kill little children. I'll tell you another indication. It's the attitude that many parents have today of their children. It's amazing how the attitude has changed. There was a time in days gone by when parents would sacrifice so much for their children. But today it's like parents want their children to sacrifice for them. I can remember growing up as a young preacher and listening and having people come to me and talk to me and talk about their marriage and talking about how, we struggled. And there were a time that we thought we were just going to split up because we just weren't made for each other, and we had our differences, but our children. We didn't want our children to go without parents, and so we stayed together and we made the sacrifice for our children. But today, because of individualism, the philosophy of individualism, relativism and all those isms, because of the narcissistic attitude that so many people have in our country today, and it's all about me and nothing else. Parents, they say, those kids can make it on their own. Because it's what I want and how I feel that really matters in life. I believe these are great indicators of how that there's been a devaluation of the value of children in our society. Now here's the point I'm leading to, folks. You know as well as I do that what's out there in our society has a way of creeping into the church. It has a way of just easing in. Sometimes it may take a while, but the philosophy and the thinking of the world has a way of just easing in. And I wonder today, if that's the case when it comes to the way that our society has devalued children. Is that sort of slowly creeping in to our thinking in our local churches? It gives me some concern when I read a poll where these preachers were asked, it wasn't just churches of Christ, denominational folks as well. They were asked, do you place children ministry a priority in your church? And only 24% of them said yes. That's 3/4. They said no. It makes you a little concerned, folks. It does make you a little concerned when another poll says, people were asked about how easy is it? How are you able to get people to staff a children's ministry? And 70% said it's very difficult to get people to staff a children's ministry. Now, I hope that's not the case here. But I know from visiting other churches, and I know from my 42 years at Hartselle, that that's sometimes very difficult. I can remember my 42 years of ministry. I just wish the educational director could come to me and say, Brother Hines, quit talking about we need Bible school teachers. Brother Hines, just stop talking that. I got them lined up and they're mad because they can't teach. I would have just been glad to have heard that one time. But I never did. In fact, I had to keep begging and begging and begging. You have older folks who say, well, I taught mine and I've done my work. And so they don't. You got younger folks that say, we have a youth minister and we'll turn over to him. And there's no involvement. It makes you wonder, has this devaluing of children today sort of just crept into our thinking in our church? I'll tell you what I've seen. I've seen that in some occasions that children's ministries and children's classes were put off into the back halls of some dark room, and there was maybe a table and a chair and some other furniture stored in there and nothing else. Children were considered maybe as just we want to get to the parents, and so we put the children over here, but the parents are the priority. And maybe we ought to change that. Maybe we ought to put up with the parents so we can get to the children. I've been in situations where you look at the church and you see how much the budget is for taking care of children and working with children and young people, and it's nothing. I've seen it. And I wonder today, folks, I really wonder today, has this philosophy crept in when I hear certain things or I have little notes written to me that says, y'all got to do something about those crying babies. And you got to do something about those kids running all over the place. I wonder, has that kind of philosophy crept into our thinking today within the church? I confess to you, there have been times in my life that I thought my work was the most important work in the church. And it's easy to get caught up in whatever ministry you're involved in and think, this is the most important and this is where I need to be involved. And sort of forget about the little children. Then I remember, folks, that the basic biblical foundation I have came from some Bible school teachers who taught me Bible facts. Came from a pew packers class. And that what I have had to build on came because there were some people who thought years ago that children really mattered. There were some older people who thought children really mattered and invested their knowledge and their wisdom into me. Makes you think. I wonder today, has this philosophy crept in? When we say to ourselves, we need to take our best teacher and we need to put them in the adult class. Isn't that sort of what we like to do today? We like to take our best teachers and we put them in the adult class. And I'm not saying those of you who teach little children are not good teachers. Don't misunderstand me. Dr. Jack Zorn started Last Leaders because the elders there came to him. And they said there in Georgia, they said, we want to bring you out of the adult class and we want to put you with the children. And that's how Last Leaders got started. I wonder today, I really do, has this crept in? You go to the Jewish culture in the Bible and you know what you find? You don't find any of that. You find there was a treasure that was placed upon little children. You find what a gift children were considered. You look all through the Bible and you see over and over again. You see women who didn't have children that prayed and begged for children because children was such a gift. And then you come to Jesus and you come to our text. Let's go to our text because here's the point I want to make today, folks. Children ought to matter to us individually, and children ought to matter to us as a church. And the reason why is because they mattered to Jesus. When you come to Mark chapter 10, you got little children that are being brought to Jesus. Now what we find, this wasn't read, but you go back up to verse 10 of Mark chapter 10, and you see in the text that Jesus was sitting in the house. Now, I can only imagine in my mind what that's like. Probably the house is full and you got all these little children because parents have brought the children to Jesus. And you got all these little children just running here and there and there. And you know how little children are. I mean, they can't be still and some of them may be crying. But here's a house and they're sitting in it and Jesus has these children. Now, what's interesting to me is that you go back just one chapter to Mark 9. And you look in Mark 9 in verse 37, and you see another incident, another situation, not the one we're in Mark 10, but on a different occasion in Mark 9. And you find in Mark 9, verse 37, these words. Whoever receives one of these little children, there were little children around again, in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. It seemed like to me, when you look at the Gospels, that what you had every time Jesus in an illustration, there was a child around. I mean, it just seemed that way. That Jesus loved little children, and children were just all around Jesus. And every time He was around, there were children around. And they mattered to Jesus. Now let's move into our text here in Mark chapter 10, and as we sort of dissect verses 13 through verse 16, and let me give you 4 reasons why children mattered to Jesus and why they ought to matter to us. Number 1, because of His touch. Because of His touch. Notice the first part of verse 13 in our text. It said, then they. Now, that has to be the parents. Who else would it be? Then they, the parents, brought little children to Him. Luke would tell us and refer to them as infants. So you're talking probably about children that are 2 or 3 years of age or younger. So they brought them to Jesus that He might touch them. Now, I want you to notice that the parents brought their children to Jesus. Someone said, well, why? Now, there are some out there who will say, oh, the reason that they brought their children to Jesus so that they could be baptized by Jesus, okay? So He could sprinkle a little water or do something like that. That's not the reason they were bringing their children to Jesus, folks. First of all, as we understand from the teaching of the New Testament, in order to have salvation, there are certain things you've got to do. You know, you got to hear, you got to repent, you got to confess. There are all these things that you've got to do that children can't do. And besides that, in John chapter 4 and verse 2, the Bible tells us Jesus didn't baptize anybody. So we know that these children are not being brought to Jesus to be baptized. What's happening here is an old Hebrew tradition. It's what Isaac did to Jacob and to Esau. He laid his hands on them and he blessed them. It's what Jacob did to Ephraim and Manasseh. He laid his hands on them and he blessed them. And that's what's happening. They're bringing for Jesus just to touch them. And Jesus wanted to touch them, and He just passed a blessing upon them. I find that interesting. Jesus touched the children. Folks, Jesus did not think that little crying babies were intolerable. Crying babies didn't bother Jesus. As I said, just picture them running around and all the things that are going on. No, Jesus understood the value of little children. And so Jesus touched them. Let me hit on this thing for a moment, though, about parents bringing in this text, they're bringing their children to Jesus. Folks, that needs to be done more today than ever before. And that is parents bringing their children to Jesus. And I'm not talking about bringing them, as I mentioned a few moments ago, and dropping them off at the church building and say, you take care of them. Parents today need to be bringing their children to Jesus by teaching them and instructing them and helping them in getting the knowledge of this book into their heart and life. They need to be instructing them and teaching them about a tremendous faith that they ought to have about a God who is a real and who is a creator of this universe. They ought to be bringing them to Jesus and teaching them about salvation and about what salvation is really like and what a commitment to Christ is all about. Parents need to be bringing their children to Jesus today to give them character and to teach them the right morals that they should have. Sometimes I have had people in the past, parents, that tell me, well, I tell you what, preacher, I'm not going to force my kids to come to church or Bible school. I'm going to let them make that decision for themselves because I think that's the way it ought to be. Folks, listen. When we make a statement like that, you know what we're saying? We're saying that God is an option. And God's not an option. Okay? And do we understand when we make a statement like that, I'm going to let them figure it out for themselves, then we're saying I'm going to let something or somebody else give them their morals, because they're going to get their morals, whether good or bad. They're going to get their character, whether good or bad, and their morals either from you, from the local church, or from somebody else or something. Now, if we don't do it, if we don't bring them to Jesus, where are they going to learn it? Well, two things, two biggies. TV and the internet. That's where they're going to learn their morals if you don't help them, if you don't teach them. The average person watches 5 to 6 hours a day of television. Some of you, that's just a starter. The average person watches or is on the internet 20 hours a week. For some of you, that's a starter on social media. Now you think about that for a moment. 5 to 6 hours a day, TV. 20 hours a week on the internet. That means if you watch TV every day of your life, 5 to 6 hours, when you got the age of 78, you would have spent 16 years of your life watching television. 20 hours a week on the internet. You spend that, as I said, that's a start for most of us. You take that 20 hours and you do it every week of your life. When you get age 78, that's 9 years of your life. Now you bring your children to Bible class. And let's be real generous here. You bring them on Sunday morning twice. You bring them on Sunday night. And then you bring them back on Wednesday. You bring them 4 times. And you do it. By the time they get to the 78 years of age, they will have given their Sunday school and their Bible, and they've given Jesus 1 year and 11 months. Now you add it up. 16 years of TV, 9 years of internet, 1.9 in church. We look around. Do you realize that by the time your child gets to the age of 18, they will have watched 200,000 acts of violence on TV. They will have watched 16,000 murders by the time of 18. And we walk around and we say, Brother Hines, what's going on with our world? What's going on with our country? We got kids walking in schools and they're just blowing people away. What has happened? Wake up, America. We have turned over the television, and I didn't even mention about all these video games where you kill everybody all the time that our kids stay on, and maybe some of you adults stay on. And we said, what is wrong, Brother Hines? Because we've turned it over to the television and the internet. By the time your children are 18 years of age, they will have watched 100,000 sexual liaisons on TV. And about 94% of them will be outside of marriage. And we walk around and wonder, what in the world's going on, Brother Hines? Everybody's living together today and nobody cares. They have no morals about them whatsoever. And Brother Hines, why is it today? Why is it today that the babies that are born in this world, the little babies that are born in this world, the majority of them are born to single moms who are 30 years of age and less? What's happened in America? Wake up. Because we quit bringing our children to Jesus. That's why the writer said in Proverbs chapter 22 and verse 6, he says, you train up a child the way he should go. Now, we train children, all right. Oh, we'll carry them. We'll go all over the country, taking them to baseball games and football games and every other kind of sport. We'll spend money on them for all kinds of coaching, for all kinds of equipment, for all kinds of instruction. Yes, sir, we know about training. We know that training is involved, and we know that training is important. And so we train and we train and train. But do we train our children and bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord? Do they really matter? Does their spiritual, their character, their understanding of God and His Word, do they really, really matter to us? That's why Moses, in Deuteronomy chapter 6, as the people of Israel were going into the land of Canaan, God is so concerned about them taking over an entirely different, into idolatry and all kinds of horrible things. And He said to those parents, He says, you speak of when you get up in the morning, when you travel along, when you sit in the house, when you go to bed at night. That's training. Think about this. We train our dogs. We put a lot of time and investment in our dogs. And for some of us, we don't train our children. You know what we do? We put our dogs that we trained up at night, and we let our teenagers that we haven't trained go out on the streets. Children mattered to Jesus, and the parents brought them to Jesus. Here's the second thing, and I need to move on. Children mattered to Jesus because we see it because of His anger. Notice in verse 13, the last part of verse 13, it says, but the disciples rebuked. This was a harsh, you look at this in Greek, folks, they weren't just like, you shouldn't do that. Oh man, this was a harsh manner. The disciples rebuked those who brought them. Now, I don't know why they did that. I've got my thoughts. Maybe they were trying to protect Jesus because they didn't want him to get so tired, and maybe that was it. Maybe they thought other things were more important, like healing people and teaching these adults. I don't know. I look at this, I think, well, maybe they were just tired of the children because it seemed like children were always around. What did Jesus do to these guys? When they got all over these parents for bringing these children to Jesus, what did Jesus do? Look at verse 14. But when Jesus saw it, He was greatly displeased. Folks, He was fighting mad. In fact, he was so mad, this is the only time you will see this Greek word in the New Testament. I mean, Jesus was furious with their attitude and devaluing the little children. When Jesus saw it, he was greatly displeased and said to them, "Let the little children come to me, and do not forbid them, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." I wonder today, does the Lord look down on us when He sees sometimes how we treat little children, if He rebukes us? I wonder how the Lord feels and thinks when He looks down on us and we're constantly complaining about the noise that children make in the church building and the mess that they make in the church building and their conduct. It seemed to me that to Jesus it was sounds of joy. In 2007, we did a $3.6 million expansion to our facility. Put a really nice fellowship area in. Boy, it was pretty. Woo, nice. In fact, we had 2 or 3 banquets from the high school that came over and used our fellowship area. Well, our kids started going in there. That's where they would go after services to run and do the things that kids do and to play. We have a preschool there in Hartselle, and so that thing's used just about every day. Those little kids would go in there and they just play and play and play. Then when we have events where we eat, the kids would just play and play. And one day somebody came and said, "We got to do something about those kids. Got to do something about them. They're putting holes in the wall." You see those holes over there? And there were. Look at all those scuff marks on that wall. They're tearing this place up. No, it was a big deal for some. Until one person stood up and said, "You know what?" He said, "You can repatch that and repair that hole in that wall. You can put some paint on that wall. And you can get the skid marks off that floor. But it's hard, almost impossible, to repair the life of a little child." I wonder how Jesus feels about us. Let me tell you, here's something to think about. Whatever makes you angry is what you care, shows what you care about the most. You think about that. These disciples did not care about children, and so they got mad. Jesus got mad because He cared about children. Whatever we get mad about the most has a lot to say about what we care about the most. The third thing I want you to notice is that children mattered to Jesus not because of His touch and because of His anger, but because of His pronouncement. Look in verse 15. He said, "Assuredly I say to you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will by no means enter it." He says, you've got to become like little children. Don't you understand? And what he's talking about, children are so trusting, and children are so receiving, and children are so dependent. And he says, you've got to come like that. You've got to become receiving, and you've got to become more dependent. You know, think about it. You take your children out to eat. They don't say, "Hey, Dad, next time I'll pay for it," do they? And we're so proud of people. You know, somebody takes us out there and we say, "Well, next time I got it. Next time I got it." But you don't see little children do that. Why? Because they're so dependent. Jesus says, that's how you've got to become. And let me just throw this in. I know my time is gone. But let me just throw this in, folks. One thing I've learned about is I've got older and retired. I've gotten bolder a little bit, you know. And I'll be through just shortly, but I want to throw this in. We see from this statement right here that children can discern spiritually. They can. And I don't know sometimes if we really realize how significant it is that we work and we focus on those children when they're children. I read this not long ago, that a children's moral values are set by the age of 9. Have you ever noticed in the Bible the emphasis that it places upon children? Train up a child. You go back. I don't have the time to preach that sermon. But you go back and you look over and over again. It's children. It's children. It's children. Do you know why? It's because in those early years of life is where their minds are molded and shaped to that which is right. A few years ago, a mom brought her 16-year-old. And she says, he's gone into drugs, he's doing this, and he's doing that. I want you to straighten him out. And I said, hey, wait a minute. You've waited 15 years and 150 pounds too late. Because it starts back here. I remember in Romania, most of those young people are bilingual. And it's amazing how they learn the language. And I was with a young lady who spoke 5 different languages. And I asked her, I said, how did you learn that? She said, well, I learned 2 in school. And the other 3 I learned as a kid when I was watching TV. And they were in other languages. And there was a child psychologist with us. And I asked her, and I was telling her about it. She says, yes. She says when children are small like that, they learn languages and certain other things in a different part of the brain than we do when we're older. And it's just like a sponge. You see, the Lord who made children, the Lord who made us, understands that. And so He says, you bring up a child. And that's why children ought to matter to us. These little ones ought to matter to us in the leadership. It ought to matter to us as old people. It ought to matter to us as young people. Because that's where those moral values and their understanding of God are set. There's the last one. Children matter to Jesus because of His blessing. Verse 15. Assuredly I say to you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will by no means enter into it. Wow. Verse 16. And He took them up in His arms. Can you picture that? He took those children up in His arms. He put His hands on them. And He blessed them. It means He fervently blessed them. Wow. Here's how we wrap this up this morning. Jesus gave 3 gifts to children. He gave them His time. He gave them His touch. He gave them His prayer. And if children valued to Jesus and mattered to Jesus, they ought to matter to us. And when it comes to the matter of children, children ought to matter in the church. And we ought to love them. We ought to accept them. We ought to teach them. And we ought to receive them. Out in Kansas, I'm told, I've never been there, I'm told that they were building an addition onto the front of the church building, and they were putting a new sidewalk in. And there was a mom who brought her little boy, just a little child. And when the cement was wet out there, she took his little feet and pointed them toward the church building and made an impression in that concrete. It was her way of saying, I commit my child. I commit my child to this church. This child matters to me. And I give this child to the Lord. Maybe we ought to have more concrete pads where moms and dads can bring their children and make that kind of commitment. Folks, listen. When children have godly parents who love them, who are concerned about them, and who do their best to be involved in their lives, and a church that really, really cares about them, You know what? I like the chances. I really like the chances of that child. Children matter. We sing this song of invitation this morning. If you're an erring child of God, there are things in your life that you need to take care of, this is where you begin. Maybe as a parent, as you've looked at your life, you say, man, I haven't been doing this. Man, I've been off on that. This is where you begin, right here, getting yourself right with God. If you're not a New Testament Christian, this is where you begin. If you want to be the kind of parent, grandparent that you want to be. You come today. You confess your faith in Christ. You be willing to change your heart, your mind, and your life. And you come and you be buried. You participate. You be buried in the death of Jesus through baptism. You participate in the death of Jesus. And the blood of Jesus Christ will wash away your sins. If you need that today, you come while we stand and while we sing.